I need to tell you something that is going to sound like a confession, because it basically is one, I did not wake up one day hating Windows. I did not have some dramatic falling out with Microsoft. I used Windows for over a decade. My entire workflow lived inside it. I knew every shortcut, every quirk, every weird little settings menu buried 4 folders deep. And for years, I told myself that familiarity was worth the price of admission, that the annoyances were just the cost of doing business on a computer, the forced restarts, the nagging pop-ups, the little inconsistencies you learn to work around without even noticing you were working around them anymore. And then October 14th, 2025 happened, and Microsoft quietly ended mainstream support for Windows 10. No farewell tour, no big announcement, just a date on a calendar that flipped. And suddenly, hundreds of millions of perfectly working computers were officially living on borrowed time. And that was the exact moment I stopped making excuses. And what I found, on the other side of that decision, genuinely shocked me in a way I was not prepared for. So here is exactly what this video is. This is not a beginner's tutorial. Explaining what Linux is, you already know that. You have probably been curious for a while and kept pushing it off because switching felt like starting your entire digital life over from scratch. This video is for you specifically. I am going to walk you through what actually changed, what surprised me, what I got wrong, and my assumptions going in, and what daily life actually looks like once you commit. No sugarcoating, no hype. And I need you to stay until the end because there is one detail about the privacy side of this that caught me completely off guard. And I follow this space closely, so if it caught me off guard, it is probably going to catch you off guard too. But first, some context. Because the situation that finally pushed me over the edge was not random, and it was not paranoia. Microsoft's own lifecycle calendar set a hard stop. Windows 10 mainstream support ended October 14th, 2025, and after that date, no more routine security patches, no more quality rollups, no more feature updates for standard consumer editions, and yes, there is an extended security update program if you want to buy yourself more time, except that program only covers you through October 13th, 2026. And enrollment requires signing into a Microsoft account even on a machine you own outright. So what you are actually being offered is a 1-year bridge on a dead platform that you pay for and jump through account hoops for. That is not a solution. That is a company charging you for the privilege of delaying the inevitable. And here is the part that made me genuinely angry when I first understood it. A lot of people assumed the obvious move was simply to upgrade to Windows 11, except Windows 11's hardware requirements quietly orphaned a massive chunk of the world's computers. Dell's own executives estimated a global installed base of roughly 1.5 billion PCs, and out of that number, something like 500 million are technically capable of running Windows 11 but have not upgraded yet, while another 500 million are simply locked out entirely, hardware incompatible under Microsoft's own baseline. Sit with that number for a second. 500 million working computers, machines that still boot, still browse, still play video, still handle. Documents perfectly fine, declared obsolete, not because they broke, not because they got slow, but because a firmware chip inside them checked the wrong box. That was the environment I was standing in when I finally made the move, and I want to be honest about the fear. Because it was real. It was not fear of Linux itself. It was fear of disruption. You spend years building a workflow. You know exactly where your files live, which app handles which task. And the idea of starting over on something unfamiliar felt like a cost I was not ready to pay. What I did not understand at the time was how much I was already quietly paying a completely different cost in Windows. I just could not see it anymore because I had normalized it. So let me describe what my actual day-to-day on Windows 11 had become, because I think a lot of you are going to recognize this uncomfortably well. Mandatory reboots for updates hitting me once or twice a week, each one eating 15 to 20 minutes and landing at the worst possible moment. Background processes and telemetry quietly chewing through 5 to 15% of my CPU. Even while the machine sat completely idle, and when I actually started tracking it, the annual time cost of forced updates and maintenance came out to somewhere between 40 and 50 hours a year. That is more than a full work week gone, because my operating system decided it needed to restart during my lunch break. And I want to plant a seed here that I'm going to come back to later, because it is the part of this story that matters most by default. Windows 11 sends telemetry on how you use your device, which apps you open, how often you touch certain features, and this cannot be fully switched off using the standard settings menu, no matter how many toggles you flip. And I will go much deeper into exactly what that means in a minute. But first, I want to walk you through what actually happened when I installed Linux Mint 22.3, codenamed Xena, which shipped in January of 2026. And within the first 48 hours, something clicked that I had known intellectually for years, but had never actually felt. There was no telemetry running by default, no advertising injected anywhere, no forced account sign-in, complete transparency about what the operating system was doing with my data. And the first morning I booted into that desktop, and realized nothing was quietly phoning home without asking me. Nothing was harvesting my habits. Nothing was nudging me toward a subscription. That quiet felt strange. Not bad strange, just genuinely unfamiliar after years of the opposite. And I want to be clear, this is not just me having a personal moment. The end of Windows 10 support has produced one of the clearest inflection points the desktop market has seen in years, a measurable wave of ordinary people, budget-conscious households, hobbyist creators, small business owners, testing and, in many cases, fully switching to Linux rather than buying new hardware or paying for a temporary bridge. And Linux desktop market share has climbed to roughly 4.7% globally as of early 2026, the highest it has ever been in its entire history, which sounds tiny until you run the math on a global user base measured in billions. And the question I kept asking myself before I actually switched was simple. Is the difference real, or is it just different? And now that I have lived on the other side of it for a meaningful stretch of time, I can give you an honest answer. The difference is not subtle. And here is exactly why. Starting with the thing that hits you first, boot time. On my machine, a mid-range laptop with an 8th generation Intel Core i5, 8 gigabytes of RAM, and a standard SSD, Windows 11 was consistently taking 55 seconds to over a minute to reach a genuinely usable desktop. And I mean actually usable, not the moment. The wallpaper loads, while 12 background processes quietly spin up behind it. Linux Mint 22.3 on that exact same hardware reaches a fully usable desktop in under 20 seconds. And that gap is not a spreadsheet number. You feel it every single morning of your life. And boot time is actually the least dramatic part of this story. The memory situation is where things get genuinely hard to explain to someone who has not seen it firsthand. Windows 11 was idling at around 2.8 gigabytes of RAM used before I had opened a single application. Linux Mint on the identical machine sits around 700 megabytes. That is not a small efficiency gain. That is your operating system quietly handing back nearly 2 full gigabytes. It was consuming on your behalf without asking or explaining why. And in practice, that means when I open a browser with a dozen tabs, a document, and a video player all at once on Linux, the system does not even register it. On Windows, the same workload had me watching the RAM gauge climb towards 7 gigabytes while I felt that unmistakable lag of a system approaching its ceiling. And I want to address the hardware compatibility fear directly, because I think a lot of you are carrying it, and it deserves a precise answer rather than a hand wave. When I first booted the Linux Mint Live USB, I was genuinely braced for the old horror stories: Wi-Fi not connecting, graphics card not recognized, touchpad behaving strangely, the kind of stuff that used to define the Linux experience 5 or 6 years ago and still lives in people's memory. What actually happened was that everything just worked. Wi-Fi connected on first boot, audio was fine, display resolution was correct immediately, touchpad gestures worked out of the box. The only manual step was installing the proprietary driver for my driver for NVIDIA card, and the built-in driver manager handed me a one-click install that took 4 minutes. And where you can still hit friction is on very new or very niche hardware. Certain Broadcom Wi-Fi chips, some gaming peripherals, the absolute newest GPU architectures where Windows drivers always land first. But for the overwhelming majority of machines that have been in service for 2 to 8 years, the experience in 2026 is frankly unremarkable. And unremarkable is exactly what you want from an operating system. Then there is the update experience, which is where the philosophical difference becomes impossible to ignore. On Windows, updates are a negotiation you never agreed to enter. The system decides when it wants to update, downloads in the background, while eating bandwidth you might be using for something else, then presents you with a restart request that has an almost supernatural ability to appear at the worst possible moment. Decline it enough times, and Windows eventually just makes the decision for you anyway. On Linux Mint, the update manager notifies you that updates exist, and you choose when to apply them in 3 months of daily use. I have rebooted for a kernel update exactly twice, both times on my own schedule, and that sense of control is not a small thing. Once you add it up over weeks and months, it means the machine is doing what you told it to do, full stop. And now let me address the software question directly, because this is the assumption that keeps the most people frozen at the edge of switching. The belief that leaving Windows means giving up the tools you rely on, and in a lot of cases, that assumption is simply outdated. LibreOffice handles Word, Excel, and PowerPoint files cleanly. Firefox and Chromium are first-class citizens. Spotify, Discord, and Zoom all ship native Linux clients. VLC behaves identically to the Windows version. DaVinci Resolve runs fully featured. Blender arguably performs better on Linux than on Windows for production workloads, and even Microsoft ships Visual Studio Code natively for Linux. While Microsoft 365 itself remains fully accessible through any modern browser, the software gap that defined this platform a decade ago has narrowed down to a specific identifiable band, primarily Adobe's Creative Suite, certain CAD platforms, and games running kernel-level anti-cheat. And if your workflow does not touch those specific tools, the gap genuinely may not affect you at all, and I was not prepared for discovering that several applications I use regularly actually run more stably on Linux than they ever did on Windows. And that is a conversation people do not have nearly enough. I want to give you one specific example because vague claims like that are easy to wave off. My video. Editing workflow used to hang randomly on Windows during long export sessions. Nothing dramatic. Just an occasional freeze that cost me 5 minutes of restarting the application and rechecking my timeline. On Linux, running the same footage through the same editor. It simply has not happened once in 3 months, and I do not know the exact technical reason for that with certainty. But I have a strong suspicion it has something to do with an operating system that is not simultaneously running a background telemetry pipeline, an update checker, and an ad delivery service while I am trying to rent a RA 4-minute clip. Now here's the part I promised you at the start. The part that genuinely caught me off guard, even though I already considered myself informed on this topic, because I did not just take Microsoft's word for what Windows collects. I ran network monitoring tools myself and cross-referenced them against Microsoft's own published documentation. And the picture that emerged was uncomfortable even for someone who thought he already knew the shape of it. By default, Windows 11 sends telemetry on how your device is used, which apps you launch, how often you touch certain features. This is framed as being for quality improvement, and it cannot be fully disabled using standard tools. No matter how many settings you flip, read that again. Slowly, there are toggles. There are privacy dashboards that make it look like you have a say. But underneath those toggles, at the actual network level, the data keeps flowing anyway. And if you are signed into a Microsoft account, some of that collection extends to location and activity data tied directly to your identity, and you can reduce it. You can never fully turn it off on consumer editions. That is not a setting you missed. That is a deliberate architectural decision. And then there is recall, which became arguably the most controversial feature Microsoft has shipped in years, an AI system built into the Copilot Plus initiative that periodically takes screenshots of your entire screen and indexes the content so it can be searched later. The stated purpose is productivity. The actual implication is that your operating system is quietly building a continuous, searchable visual record of everything you have ever done on your own machine. And when recall was first announced in 2024, the backlash was immediate and severe enough that Microsoft delayed the rollout and reworked parts of the implementation. But the feature still exists, it is still being pushed, and the instinct that produced it in the first place tells you everything you need to know about where this platform's direction is actually heading. Now compare that directly to what happened when I booted into Linux Mint and ran a network monitor during completely normal use. The constant background chatter Windows generates, even on a freshly installed system with nothing open, simply was not there. My machine was not checking in with a licensing server, was not syncing behavior to some cloud endpoint. It was just running quietly for me. And Linux Mint's own documentation states plainly that it collects no telemetry by default and is fully transparent about anything you optionally opt into. One operating system treats your usage data as a resource to be mined for advertising and product direction. The other treats privacy as a baseline right rather than a feature you have to go looking for. And that contrast, once you actually feel it rather than just read about it, is not subtle at all, and the security picture reinforces the same divide. Linux benefits from open source scrutiny going back decades. Over 13,500 developers have contributed to the Linux kernel since 2005, according to the Linux Foundation, which means when a vulnerability surfaces, thousands of eyes across the planet can see the code, flag the problem, and push a fix transparently in the open. On Windows, you are trusting a single corporation to find, prioritize, and patch vulnerabilities entirely on its own internal timeline, a timeline that has not always inspired confidence. And I want to be honest about the flip side too, because pretending Linux is flawless would be dishonest and would honestly backfire the moment you hit the first thing that does not work exactly the way you expected. So here is the real limitation, the one I will not soften at all. If your primary use for your PC is competitive multiplayer gaming with kernel-level anti-cheat, Valorant, Fortnite, Apex Legends, Linux is not your answer right now. That is not a technical gap the community failed to close. It is a deliberate policy. Decision by those specific developers to block Linux at the anti-cheat layer, and until that changes, it is a hard wall. If those exact titles are central to how you use your computer, know that going in before you wipe anything, for essentially everything else in gaming, the picture is dramatically better than most people expect. In my own library, every single game except one worked on Linux without much fuss through Valve's Proton compatibility layer, running at performance equal to or better than Windows, and you can check any specific title yourself on ProtonDB. Before you commit to anything, and I want to zoom out for a second, because none of what I just walked you through is happening in isolation. This is not just me and a few thousand other people quietly switching operating systems. Microsoft's own pricing decisions have been pushing entire organizations toward the exact same door. Price increases rolling through the Microsoft 365 commercial suite are set to land across 2026, and depending on the license tier, some businesses are staring down increases as steep as 30% or more, which is the kind of number that gets escalated straight to a finance committee and finance committees once they run the real math. Keep landing on the same uncomfortable conclusion that walking away costs less over 5 years than staying ever will. And it is not just businesses. Entire governments have reached the same conclusion for reasons that go beyond cost entirely. European administrations have been actively migrating away from Microsoft's ecosystem toward Linux and open formats, citing digital sovereignty and a desire to stop depending on a single foreign company for the software running their hospitals, courts, and public institutions. And when a national government formally certifies an alternative for its own critical infrastructure, it does something an advertising budget never could. It grants a kind of quiet cultural permission. It tells every hesitant IT department, every school system, every small business owner sitting exactly where I was sitting a few months ago that this is not a fringe decision anymore. It is simply a prudent one. And once you see that permission spreading, you start noticing it everywhere, in comment sections, in forum threads, in the group chat where someone finally admits they have been quietly running Linux at home for 6 months and did not tell anyone because they assumed people would think it was strange. And it is not strange anymore. It is just what a growing number of ordinary people are doing. One person on one laptop next to that much larger picture. Businesses recalculating their 5-year spend and governments rethinking who controls their infrastructure. You start to see that this is not a coincidence at all. It is a convergence. 3 completely different groups of people arriving at the exact same conclusion from 3 completely different directions: cost, control, and consent. And I did not expect switching my own laptop to feel connected to something that large when I started this, but it genuinely does. So if you are sitting on hardware Microsoft has quietly declared obsolete, or you're just tired of an operating system that treats your attention as a resource to be harvested rather than something to be respected, I'm not going to tell you the switch is effortless. There is a real adjustment period. There are a small number of tools you may genuinely miss, but for the overwhelming majority of what people actually use a computer for, browsing, email, documents, media, even most gaming, the difference is not marginal. It is not a lateral. Move dressed up as an upgrade. It is a genuinely faster, quieter, more honest way of using a machine you already own. And the moment I stopped treating that difference as a rumor and actually lived inside it for a few months, the switch stopped feeling like a sacrifice and started feeling like getting something back that I did not realize I had already lost. So if this video actually changed how you're thinking about that laptop sitting under your desk, the one Microsoft told you has no future, do one thing for me. Go check whether your own hardware qualifies. Run the numbers on what you are actually paying in time, in privacy, and in money to keep using a system that was never really built to serve you in the first place. And decide for yourself whether the difference is worth it. And if you are worried about doing it wrong, about breaking something, about ending up worse off than where you started, that fear is normal. I felt it too, but the version of Linux sitting on my laptop right now is not the version that scared people away a decade ago. It is quieter, it is faster, it asks for less, and it gives back more than I expected. In almost every category I actually measured, and honestly, the hardest part of the entire process was not the technical side at all. It was unlearning the assumption that switching had to be painful, because for me, it absolutely was. Not painful, just genuinely worth it.